Fat and fiber, obviously the next rung up the pyramid. So for fat, the considerations generally are satiety. We need enough fat per meal to slow gastric emptying and promote postprandial satiety. If you speak to people who are maybe deep in competition prep and have reduced their fat very, very low, you will often hear them say that that fat intake causes kind of a perma-hunger, that drop. So as soon as they bump it up to a slightly more reasonable intake, they start to feel less hungry. Whether that's independent of calorie intake or not, I'm not sure. It could well be completely dependent on calorie intake. However, on a mechanistic level, it can slow gastric emptying and can promote satiety as well. We also need to provide essential fatty acids. The essential fatty acids for humans are EPA and DHA. I'm not going to say the full names because they're really long and pointless. If you want to look them up, then go for it. But what you need to know is that they are essential nutrients. They are the fats found in fish oil. So we do need to consider fat intake for provision of essential fatty acids. And then again, personal preference is going to be a big player when it comes to how much fat somebody's eating per day. And the easiest way to do this is to collect a food diary and see kind of what food somebody is eating. You'll be able to get a good gauge from a food diary of whether somebody prefers more carbohydrate dense foods or more fat dense foods, or potentially if somebody is coming to you who has comparatively high carbohydrate and fat intakes and comparatively low protein intakes, you may need to do a little more experimentation to find out which macronutrient out of fat and carbohydrates they would prefer to sacrifice to bump that protein intake up just a little bit. So when it comes to the exact percentage of calories from fat, this has been a source of controversy for quite a long time. Digging through the research on saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, for example, total fat intake and cardiovascular disease, stroke, things like that. There was a 2017 study, I believe it was called the PURE study, that found that the total fat intake didn't really seem to have much of an effect on cardiovascular disease, which is pretty good news. It's been coming for a while that fat is not the devil necessarily. 10 to 50% of calories, certainly in the short term, has shown to have pretty much no risk of adverse health. We don't necessarily know too much about the longer term. Below 10% runs the risk of essential fatty acid deficiency. In terms of grams per kilogram intake, this tends to equate to around about 0.3 to 0.5 grams per kilogram of body weight of fat intake. What we tend to recommend here is 15 to 35% of calories from fat. And again, this is not a hard and fast rule. There are contexts in which going above 35% of calories from fat is applicable and useful. And there are going to be contexts in which going below 15% again is applicable and useful, certainly in the short term. But this is going to allow generally for a convenient intake of fat. It's going to allow most people to have a sufficient carbohydrate intake. And it's also probably going to be safe. Again, our number one concern with our clients is going to be safety and long-term health. And this is generally a moderate fat intake for most people. Most people are probably going to be fine on this.